You're doing well. We're going to get Eric on the call here. We're going to talk about core stuff. Get Eric here in a second. See if Eric has gotten the invitation. Good old technical difficulties. Hopefully we get Eric on here. Last time we tried to do this, we had a little craziness. Eric, it looks like you've joined. Oh, hold on a second. There it is. It says you're unable to join. Okay, lovely. Good old internet stuff. Hold on. Oh, wait. There he is. Yes.
You got to let me in, Terry. It's like
Dude,
Studio 54.
I'm sitting there. You know what I think? I think we crossed the streams, right? I think I was inviting you, and you were trying to hack in, and I think we had a crossing of the streams. And you know what they say in Ghostbusters: never cross the streams. How you doing, buddy?
And so we are here.
We are here. Let me turn my.
Let's talk core training, man.
Core. So we're just going to talk about planks for 1 hour. No. Let's. Well, why don't we sort of dive into sort of core training, and let's talk about what core training isn't in our eyes, and then we can talk about what it is. I think when people assume that they're doing core training, they think that if they just do a bunch of flexion biased exercises, right? They just start doing a bunch of crunches or flutter kicks or leg lifts, and their abs start to burn. It's immediate transfer on how that's going to help with their sport, or it's going to protect their low back, or et cetera. So I think when people think core, they assume, hey, if my abs are burning, then probably I'm doing core work. And yes, you are working that musculature, but what is the carryover, right? How often do you have to do a bunch of repetitive biased flexion-based movements in life? The only sport that I would even say that would be something you may want to train a little bit would be in jiu-jitsu, but even that, you do so much of it in your sport already. It's probably not the best choice when it comes to core training. So core training is not a bunch of crunches. It's not crunch variations. Yes, it's a way to get things tired, but the carryover isn't there. And core isn't just a bunch of plank variations. Yes, that is a possibility, but guys, everyone thinks core is just, if you just work the six-pack muscles and then the muscles around your trunk, things are going to go well. But there's so many intricacies of core training. We've got the inner unit, the outer unit. We've got anti-extension, anti-flexion, rotation, yada, yada, yada. So what is the biggest sort of issue you see with people doing core work, Eric? Did I lose you there, bud?
Yep, well, you froze for a second there, but now we're back. The biggest thing we need to distinguish is when most people think of core, they're talking about, I want to have visible abdominal muscles. I want to have a six-pack at the beach, right? And so we need to kind of first get that off the table, because how many times, have, you've been through it as a coach, where we go through a whole comprehensive workout, check all the boxes, and then your client says, hey, can we add some ab stuff in? And I'll say, like, well, what do you think you were doing in your front squat? What do you think the get-ups were? What do you think this was? Do you think your abs were not working? Because you would have fell down if that was the case. So we've already checked that box, right? So what you're talking about is, I want to look like I have chiseled six-pack at the beach. That gets done in the kitchen. That gets done, right? That's a fork and knife exercise. That is about diet. And that, the joke is, I have the best abs in the world. I'm just keeping them a secret. They're just buried underneath a bunch of pizza and cannolis, right? So if you want to have the visible six-pack, that's a nutritional issue, right? So let's distinguish that and get that off the table first. Now, having that operational tissue underneath that. Now we have to look at, well, we're looking at aesthetics or we're looking at function, because there may be two different things, right? And how I would train as a bodybuilder to train my abs versus how I would train as an athlete to train my abs are two very different things. And so we have to kind of distinguish what that is. And then before we even get any deeper, we have to actually define what the hell are we even talking about? Like, what is your core, right? Because we can even get into debates on what that actually even is. So
Yeah.
I'm going to throw it back at you. Like, what's your definition? Someone says, well, what is your core? What is that? It's not just your rectus abdominis, and it's not just this, one slate of muscles right here.
Well, you know what? I think, and again, it's the old sort of how simple and how advanced do we want to get. So here's the way that I look at it is, first of all, the core does not work independently from all of the other attachments. Think of the pelvis, for example. You've got attachments of your hip flexor, you've got one attachment of your rec fem on your quadricep, and then you've got the abdominal attachments lower. So if you're going to say abdominals, then how can you not say hip flexors and the tissues that attach to the pelvis? And same thing when you're dealing with the rib cage and the upper thorax. So I guess one of the simplest ways I would say, if you cut the arms and legs off, what's left is the core. But even then, there's a bunch of intricacies, because if you really want to start about attachment points, insertion points, and blah, 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 then you have to go down that rabbit hole. But if, in my opinion, you have to include the pelvis, you absolutely have to include the rib cage and the thorax. But I would say, if you were to sort of take off the glenohumeral joint, and if you were to take sort of the femoral head out completely, what's left, in my opinion, is the core.
Okay, so if we're going to go with that definition, take off the head, the arms, the legs, right?
Yes.
Which, as you kind of elegantly pointed out, okay, what happens to my lat, right? Because my lat's attaching to my humerus, and that's a pretty big honking muscle that's taking up a lot of that surface area. And if we look at that, and we look at how that creates tension, well, your lat is one of your biggest muscles surface area wise, and it attaches not to a bony attachment, but attaches to this diamond shape of fascia. That's your thoracolumbar fascia in your low back, and it creates a force couple with your opposite glute. And your glute is one of your big drivers and stabilizers and movers of stabilizers your pelvis and mover your femur. So then you take the femur out. Well, we can't just simply do that. So first of all, understand that there is that grayness to all of this of like, what even is your freaking core, right? So that being said, let's talk about if we're going to just make it simple, arms, legs, and head off. What does your core even do? So I had a post yesterday I put up that there's 3 primary things that your core does. One of them, okay, is a communication tool. It is the communication between your right and left sides. It's the communication between your upper and lower body, right? So we transmit force that has to go through there, right? Other than a bicep curl or a knee extension, and even those we can argue that there's going to be some level of core involvement just because of the way our neurology is, right? But with those things, right, that's the communicator, right? So when we walk, something as simple as walking, that as I go into extension and my right arm comes back, my left leg comes back, that's that force couple of the lat and glute connecting together. When I go to change direction and rotate, it's the adductor on one side connecting with the oblique of the opposite side. And so what's in the middle, the great transmitter, is your core. And so Dr. Greg Rose, who we work with through FMS and SFMA, is also, TPI and on base. One of the great analogies he uses is, think of an extension cord, right? And you have a male and female end. And so if your upper and lower body have to connect in the middle, right? If that extension cord comes unplugged, you lose the energy transfer from upper and lower body. And so being able to connect that is one of the big things we do. So we talk about, like you talk about, anti-extension, anti-rotation, or anti-even side flexion. That's a part of that, is that communication of how that relates one side to the other. So that's just one of the functions of the core, and that we look at. And so that communication is something that's very misunderstood, right? So then if we look at the second thing of what it does, is it helps, it's what we call a feed forward mechanism, that this proximal stability that's happening allows for distal mobility. right? So what are the things that can stabilize your trunk and your pelvis and your spine? It's, you know, all these muscles that we're talking about at the core. But guess what else can do that? Your lats, your hip flexors, your hamstrings. And so when the muscles of your core aren't functioning, those big prime movers kick in. And then what happens? You move like a block, right? You don't move fluidly because you don't have the stability. So all of a sudden these muscles kick on and say, holy shit, something's going to have to stabilize this. So they will. And so now you move very stiff, and it can actually show up as a mobility problem, right? So how many times have we seen someone's leg raised, we automatically want to blame their hamstring when it's really the hamstring's the only thing stabilizing your pelvis. The last thing you want to do is stretch that thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think a lot of the things people like to do is they like to play the blame game, and they like to blame it on one muscle. Like if we could get to the point where we could blame one muscle, we would be so good at fixing people, because we could just say, oh, you have a tight, you know, it's the old, you've got a tight hip flexor. So if we stretch the hip flexor and we tighten the glute and we get the glute stronger, everything will magically get better. Well, shit, if that was the case, we would be geniuses and we'd be able to fix everybody's back pain, because people want, here's the issue with most people. They want a concrete answer. They don't want the "it depends" answer, because the concrete answer is gonna scratch that itch for them. Oh, it's just my tight hip flexors. I can't tell you how many times people have come in, and you've seen this too. I've got tight hip flexors. You put them on the table, do a Thomas test, modified Thomas test. You know, their femur drops below parallel, and you're like, yeah, well, guess what? You know that hip flexor that you thought was tight? Yeah, that's actually loosey goosey. You've got something else going on. So I think, again, we live in a world where people want instant gratification. They want instant answers. That's why how many people say, well, you have back pain because you have a weak core. Well, shoot, I mean, I've had back pain before, and I can do kneeling rollouts and a bunch of, high level core exercises. But if that was just the case, I would never have back pain. So it's definitely multifactorial. And having a strong core is important for sure. We know this, but at the same time, we can't blame everything on a weak core as well, because if it was that easy, we just, like Greg Cook said a long time ago, if you've got a weak core, a bunch of planks ain't going to fix that shit. And that's really what it boils down to. And I'll be even honest, even just doing regular core training is not going to fix low back pain. You can bird dog, clamshell, and curl up every single one of your clients with low back pain. It doesn't mean things are going to get fixed. I lose you there?
That feed forward mechanism is a timing issue, right? Is a feed forward mechanism. Yes. Means is we create intrinsic stabilization milliseconds before in our trunk before we move through our extremities. And that goes back to how the TVA became the sexiest muscle in the world. And, back in the late 90s when I started doing this, right? The transverse abdominis, which is this thin sheath of muscle that's almost like an internal weight belt, became the sexiest thing, because one of the things it does is it creates this corset type of effect. But understand that there's a lot more to it. It's also involved in breathing, right? And so your TVA gets involved in that situation. So if we just pull your belly button in, well, you made great. You create a quote unquote functional core with dysfunctional breathing, which is going to lead to a dysfunctional core. And then also, it wasn't about the tensile strength of this super thin tissue. It was about the timing of it. It was about the timing of that the people who are healthy, when they move their arms or legs, that those inner unit muscles, the TVA, the internal obliques, the pelvic floor, they all turned on before your lat, your hamstring, and those types of things. And the people who were unhealthy, the people who had the back pain, it was the opposite, right? They were using their prime movers to try to stabilize. So it's a timing issue, right? So it's a communication tool. It's a timing issue. And then it's there to, and this is the other thing, is you see on Twitter and all these other things, is that, oh, well, the core isn't about movement. The core is about stabilization, right? It's about bracing and holding the spine and pelvis in place. And yeah, that's certainly a part of it. I better be damn sure to have a core that can do that if I'm going to front squat or deadlift or swing a kettlebell. But I don't want that type of stabilization if I'm throwing a ball or if I'm sprinting or any of those type of things. So there's almost two ends of the continuum here when we talk about core stability, right? Is you're talking about core stability for a high threshold type of bracing activity, or you're talking about core stability for an athletic dynamic event, right? And so that's why even in the FMS, we have a trunk stability push-up, which is looking at high threshold extrinsic stabilization for an activity, a high load activity like a push-up, or you have the rotary stability, which is much more intrinsic reflexive type of stability, which is a completely different type of thing, and you need both. And how many times you've been in teaching a course when you walk around the room and somebody's failing miserably at rotary stability, they walk over and say, oh, you got to tighten your core, you got to brace your core, because that's everybody's answer to core training, right? Is tighten, brace, squeeze, and bear down. And what happens? They get worse. They fall over. And so talk about a little bit about like the strategies of how we end up checking both of those boxes, because they're really opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah. So here's one of the analogies I use, because I'll be honest, early on when I was learning about the inner unit, the outer unit, inner core, outer core, I was pretty confused, because I thought it was, well, if I just breathe and brace, I'm going to be good. So here's the way that I like to sort of discuss it. We talk about the rotator cuff, right? So the rotator cuff, it does several different things. It's several different muscles, but really what the job of the rotator cuff is to keep the ball in the socket, right? And depending on what movement pattern you're going into, different muscles are going to fire at different time. But the rotator cuff needs to be fast. It does not need to be strong. You do not need to do side-lying external rotations with 35 pounds. You don't need to do that. So if you think about how the rotator cuff functions, right, you have to put the cuff in an environment where it's going to, depending on the exercise, it's going to stabilize reflexively. And one of the things you cannot do if you're training the rotator cuff is you cannot overuse your grip and use that feed forward tension strategy. So for example, if you are doing an exercise where you're trying to fire your cuff, but you're using a white knuckle grip, your pecs kicking in, your lats are kicking in, and your triceps are kicking in, you've got these big giant prime movers that have the ability to create so much tension and force. There's no way in hell these little fast stabilizers are going to be able to keep up with the prime movers, because they're just going to get overpowered. And that's the same thing that happens with the inner and outer core. Everybody thinks, well, core is just breathing and bracing. So what do? They do a bunch of planks. They do planks with rows. They do this and that. And those aren't bad exercises, but that's only training one side of the core. If you want to create an environment to get the inner core to sort of come online, you actually have to do the opposite. You have to slow down your breathing. You have to stay relaxed. You have to pay attention to overall tension in the system. And if you're in a sympathetic state, a really, really high, like highly driven, stimulated state, it's going to be very, very hard to create an environment where that inner unit can do its thing, because all of those prime movers that are surrounding the inner core, the rectus abdominis, external obliques, spinal erectors, those guys are going to overpower the inner unit, which, like you said, TVA, pelvic floor, multifidus, etc. So in order to create an environment for the inner unit to function correctly, I think the first thing we need to do is, one, we need to find a position where the client can relax. And for most people, supine and that supported spine position, whether it's hook lying at 90-90, is a really nice place to start, because they can get everything to relax. They've got the floor to relax on. But then we got to get them breathing correctly, because a lot of people cannot breathe without holding their breath or having all this excessive tension. They're like, yeah, how's my breathing look? And you're like, you look like the damn velociraptor from Jurassic Park, because all this other stuff's kicking in. So even before we talk about the muscles and this and the strategies, we have to create an environment where everybody's just, not everybody, but where your clientele is just down regulating a little bit. They can control their breathing. They're not having excessive tension in the system. And then that is probably the best environment to start re-educating or trying to train that inner core. But I'm going to tell you right now, it's hard to do, and there's a lot of subtleties, and most coaches, they don't know how to train it. So what do? They just plank everybody.
And there's a ton of points that I want to touch on that you just brought up. One is breathing, and understanding that one of the big muscles that's in this cavern is your diaphragm, and your diaphragm is the regulator of your breathing. And if that doesn't move and function properly, then everything else around that, because it's on the same neurological loop as all those inner unit muscles, and muscles that are wired together fire together, right? So even your adductors are part of that neurological loop. So that's why sometimes we'll squeeze something between the knees. It'll create better core engagement just by a reflexive stabilization through in there. But the thing you're talking about, and I think I want to build on, is that the postures, positions, and shapes, right? And saying, if we're stabilizing, what are we trying to even stabilize in the first place? So first things we need to understand is the positioning of the thorax, right? And am I in thoracic flexion? Am I in overextension, or am I in neutral, right? If we look at even the position of the sternum and how some people will have more of a preference or a lean towards a more of an open angled sternum versus a closed angle sternum. Bill Hartman does some really good work with this, and how you might want to change your exercises and even how you coach your breathing slightly differently. If you have someone who has a more open flared type of sternum, or some people call it like a flared rib type of scenario, that's more of an inhalation based strategy versus more of an exhalation based strategy. If you have this angle right here, right, that should be at about 90 degrees if it's more closed or more open. So that positioning, the positioning of your pelvis, right? So if we have that anterior tilt because we're seated all day and we're now in a shortened hip flexor that's pulling that pelvis into an anterior tilt. If we don't learn how to establish neutral and just teaching people how to move their pelvis, and this is one of the more frustrating and sometimes entertaining things to see. If ask somebody to just, and this is one of the tests we do in On Base or TPI, is can you tilt your pelvis forward and back? Can you rotate your pelvis side to side? Can you? And people just, you'll watch somebody say, all right, can you tilt your pelvis? And they'll go, did I do it?
Yeah,
And
their whole entire body moves. It's
they
like
can't.
Yeah.
And so the awareness of those positions and postures are the foundation for all this stuff. Because if not, you're talking about stability and stabilization of really crappy positions. And so you're just reinforcing those positions. So we have to understand and appreciate that before we even talk about this gross stabilization. And then let's take it all the way on the opposite side. And part of that other third function of your core is to stabilize, but it's also to control and sometimes to create, but also control movement throughout the trunk. And so when I do that, if I go to throw a ball, there's a sequence that should happen, that my pelvis should move first, and then my thorax, and then my shoulders, and then my arm, if I have proper sequencing, right? But if I can't distinguish and create what they call a hip shoulder separation and have that disassociation because I have no awareness of that, well, then now all of that sequencing of that muscle, and I'm going to lose force production along that chain somewhere there. So part of that is for every motion that we're doing, if I'm rotating to the left, all the muscles that would rotate me right are the decelerators of that motion. So like if we look at TPI power testing, I'll look at a shot put throw, both right and left. And I'll have people that can, chuck a ball 40 something feet righty, and then lefty, it's like 20 feet. And that's a huge discrepancy. And that's going to not only limit their force production, but that's going to lead to much more susceptible to injury. Same thing goes for flexion and extension. We're always so flexion biased, but realize that everything that's going to flex you is also going to resist extension and anti-extension. And I'm going to have a post later today showing with some of my baseball pitchers. As they go back into full layback and get into extension, are they banging into all their facet joints? Or are they decelerating through their anterior core? And I know you've done some work with some NFL players, NFL linemen especially, they're getting shoved back, and how many of them have lumbar facet issues? Or even your fighters, their ability to fight, that extension force comes from their abdominals, but not because they're creating flexion, because they're fighting extension.
Yeah. So there's a couple things I want to hit that point, but there's two things that you said that you made me think. So first of all, neutral. Please understand that neutral is a range. It's not a destination, right? It's neutral for one person is going to be not neutral for someone else. If someone is biased towards that big anterior tilt, they may need to do more of a posterior tilt to get into their neutral and vice versa. So neutral is a range. So you don't have to get out the goniometers and start measuring each person's pelvic and ribcage position. That is not necessary. It's a range. And more importantly is that your clients understand where that range is, right? If you're a little off, if you're a little bit biased towards flexion or extension, it's not a big deal, right? So that's one thing. Neutral is a range. It is not a concrete destination. And the other thing we have to talk about, and you did a great, you were talking about sort of rotational stuff. So rotational sports, you train a lot of baseball players, you're involved with On Base U. I train a lot of fighters. And one of the things that we have in common is what? Medicine ball throws. And people think, well, a medicine ball throw is going to automatically teach someone how to hit the drive, hit a drive farther in golf, or hit a baseball further, or hit harder. No, the whole purpose of medicine ball training is sequencing, is getting the right things to happen at the right time. And when that happens, that's what we're looking for. And, you know, if you're throwing a medicine ball, it starts with force through the ground, and then you translate through the hip, through the thorax, and then whatever you're trying to express through that upper extremity. Actually, Greg Rose did a really, really cool video yesterday. I don't know if you saw this on TPI, but he's in a chair. And what he does is he actually sits in a chair and he uses his leg and he spins himself around with one leg, and he spun. And then he lifted his legs up and he tried to spin. And guess what? He couldn't spin nearly as well. Because why? Because he didn't have any power into the ground. So a medicine ball is a tool to teach you about sequencing. It's force production into the ground, through the hip, through the torso, and then we are going to store that energy briefly, and we are going to express that energy, whether it's a throw, a drive, or a punch. So that's one of the reasons why medicine ball training is so important. It's nothing magical about throwing a medicine ball and you're just going to all of a sudden, you know, put an extra 50 yards on your drive and start, you know, crushing bombs over center field. It's a tool to teach sequencing and timing. And that's what people need to understand. It's not this magical elixir or this magical thing that's all of a sudden going to make you, you know, starting to knock people out or, you know, hit a baseball 100 feet further.
And to pick up something you're talking about with the whole neutral thing, is a lot of the coaching cues that have become popularized. Like take, for example, some of the stuff you guys teach with Strong First is this teaching ribs down, right? Teaching tucking under, right? So what if I have somebody who walks in slumped where their ribs are already almost pinned to their pelvis, right? And they're in this huge thoracic flexion. And then they have this tail, this flat ass and tucked under tail. And I'm going to try to coach further into that. Like how many times we teach any type of dead bug or hurdle type position on the ground to try to teach stabilization. And they'll say, am I supposed to press my back into the ground? No, you're supposed to, the whole point of the, there's a bunch of different drills that I love to do and that we'll post about different, what I call hurdle position or dead bug type of things. The whole idea of those drills is that when you extend your arm up overhead, your lat, which attaches into your arm, and then down into your thoracolumbar fascia, when you bring your arm up overhead, it's one of the ways you test lat length, is you put someone against the wall and bring their arms up overhead. If they go into a big extension in their low back, sometimes it's a tight lat, sometimes it's the inability to control the pelvis because that lat is trying to pull you into extension. And so the whole idea is when your arm comes up overhead or you extend the leg out because you have your hip flexor in the front of your hip, and as you extend your leg out in a dead bug or a heel tap or something like that, that hip flexor is trying to pull you into extension. Your whole job is to fight that. And so I'm not trying to tell you to tuck under. I'm telling you, don't let that pull it out of that neutral position, whatever that neutral is for you. And so understanding, how do I find that neutral? Well, just simply take your pelvis, and I always say it's like a bowl of water, pour the water out the front, pour the water out the back, and do that a couple times, and then pull yourself back into whatever the middle of those two are. And that's kind of what you talked about. That's the range you have to own. Now, as you extend your arms and legs, you know, in opposite direction, it's going to try to do this to you. Don't let that happen. So like the video I'm going to post later with my pictures, we do what's called a posterior reach. I put, you know, we can do it with just body weight, or we put a band in their hands and it's trying to pull them back into extension. Their whole job is to own that. And the way I describe it is, and I should probably do a video about this, I talk about the four corners of your core, right? So you have your two rib points, right? If you feel the bottom of your ribs, and you have your two hip points in front. So imagine 1, 2, 3, 4, and imagine this square, right? Well, sometimes we want these to move away from these. We need to have that happen for me to load up to serve a tennis ball. Sometimes we don't want these to move away from each other. Sometimes I want this to tuck under and get closer to this. In the finish of my golf swing, I should be tucking under as to get my glutes through it at the end of extension. Sometimes you want this to rotate over this and have this not move. Sometimes you want this to not move. You want this to rotate under that. Sometimes we need this to side bend. Sometimes we don't want that to side bend. So if you think about those four corners, what do you want each of those points to do is really what the essence of what core training is do I want them to close? Do I want them to open? Do I want them to not open? Do I want this one to stay and this one to move? Do I want this one to not move, this one to move? Do I want this one to go this way? Do I want this one to go this way? So that's really how we look at core training. I should be like a puppet.
Yeah, I feel like you need puppets right now. What are you doing?
Yeah.
No, but so what was cool about that is you just kind of went on for a couple of minutes, but this is the sort of the intricacies that we need to talk about, especially if you are working with athletes that are asking a lot of their body. Now, how much of this core training do you need? Well, again, it goes to it depends, and we always talk about what are you asking of your body, and I love the line that you use about thoracic rotation. You do an assessment on someone, and you test their rotation of their T-spine, and they say, is that good? Well, yeah, for an accountant, you've got great thoracic rotation, right? But for a baseball player, it's really not good. So it always comes back to, what are you asking of your body? Because I think that's something that people don't think about is, if you're just going to go and you're trying to just stay healthy and you're going to a gym a few days a week, getting some total body stuff, you don't have to go down those crazy rabbit holes, right? But if you are working with an athlete that is really, really at a high level, and maybe they've got some things going on, or you're working on a post rehab case, then yeah, you're going to want to be able to go down rabbit holes, right? But start simple and then go down to the rabbit holes as needed, but just don't start in the rabbit hole, because then you got to dig yourself back out when it could have been a simple observation to begin with. So I think, core training is complicated, but it doesn't need to be complicated, because I think, one of the biggest issues is that people think that you need to do all of this crazy fancy stuff where you're standing on one leg and you're rotating and you're bending and you're turning your head and you're doing all this stuff. Is just remember, what are you asking of your body? And I think that's going to give you some great answers, when it comes to core training in general. And something you brought up at the beginning is, is the six pack. People think if they do core work, they're going to get a six pack. But listen, you can have a 10 pack and be shredded and have a very weak, crappy core. And you could have a lot of extra adipose tissue and have a really, really strong core. So the aesthetic component is simply that. It's aesthetics. Aesthetics do not equal function. That's just really how it is. So, I mean, the core talk, it's funny because you were talking about all the various attachments, and I think of the old Paul Chek course, Ultimate Core, and I still have the binder, with the 300-page binder, and still I refer to that because, early on, Paul Chek had some really, really good stuff on core training. So you can definitely go through some rabbit holes with this stuff.
Yeah, function certainly does not equal aesthetics or one or the other. As a Yankee fan, I can tell you, because Vladimir Guerrero, who's definitely not chiseled, hit 3 home runs that still haven't landed against the Yankees the other night. So the other piece is you talk about how much. So how much at the end of the day do you separate out? Because when we talk about designing programs, we have a whole course on designing programs. We do a live course. We have one coming up in 2 weeks. And one of the things we're going to do is case studies. And we give people case studies. And one of the things they do, if you look at the most common session charts, what does it have? It has, warm up or stretches. It has a section for foam rolling. It has a section for power. And it may have a whole section for core. Do we need a whole section for core? How much do you isolate out of a program and say, we need to dedicate this? So we're checking the boxes, all right? We're going to push, we're going to pull, we're going to bend, we're going to twist, we're going to do those things. Do we need to check a box for core?
I rarely have a dedicated core spot in my program. I use it as one of my fillers. And we talk about that, function, fillers, foundational exercises, all of the F's. But no, I rarely program a core block. Because, for example, I've got a couple guys that are getting ready to fight in the UFC within the next 2 to 3 weeks. These guys are doing carries with 150-pound sandbags. They don't need more core work than that, right? I mean, they are getting, and you got to think about what else they're doing in their training, right? So it's like bringing sand to the beach. Do you really need that much more? No, you don't. Now, don't get me wrong. If there's a scenario where, let's say, you're working with an athlete and we talked about adductors earlier, right? Adductors, wires together, fires together. Adductor pulls are a common sort of injury in mixed martial arts and jiu-jitsu based off of the positions. So what I'll do is, I'll add in some adductor planks or Copenhagen planks as a filler, but I don't have a dedicated core section, because let's be honest, if you did 15 minutes of core, first of all, you're gonna hate it. You can get 2 to 3 minutes of core total in a day and get exactly what you need. because the core does not function in isolation. And people think that, oh, I got to do all these core drills, but you got to think more movements, not just core, because anybody can make your abs burn. It doesn't mean anything. It really does not. It just means you're overusing the muscle. It's like using mini bands to try to get someone's balance better. It's just going to burn them out. And yes, you can do a bunch of clamshells and get the hips on fire. It doesn't mean they're going to be able to stand on one leg. So it's the same thing with function.
Well, there's a couple great things I want to take out of that. Is number one is I put up a post on our, if you go back and through our post, why you don't make your exercise decisions solely based on EMG studies, because if it looked at, you know, your core activation in a front squat versus some other different drills, right? And your front squat, deadlift, that kind of thing. And the big moves, front squats, deadlifts, create higher EMG activity in your core muscles and abdominals than a lot of these isolated moves where you may feel quote unquote more burn, right? Just because of the threshold it has to have to create that stabilization. So once we can get you to the point where you are front squatting and deadlifting and doing, you know, chin-ups and all those things, the need for isolated core work is really almost non-existent, number one. And then number two, you know, the number two is that, well, it doesn't mean that there's no value in that, because then you'll take the other side of things, right? You'll have the strength coach who say, oh, it's a complete waste of time. No, what it does is it creates the awareness of pelvic position, of disassociation, of all those things that allows me to do the med ball throws and the chin-ups and the deadlifts and the front squat. So I use those as a building block to get to there, so you can feel that awareness. And you talked about our 5 F's. So in the course, we talk about the 5 F's to writing a program. Well, one of those is fillers/feeders. So yes, it's a great filler/active reps, but it's also a great feeder to, let's say I may do a supine, like bilateral heel tap on the ground in between sets of squats, because it coaches that nice tall spine. It coaches them how to hold neutral while they're trying to get pulled into extension. So that's a nice in-between thing. Am I doing it to build sexy abs? No, I'm doing that to create awareness that's going to help that next set be better because of a better neural picture in that client's mind of what I need to feel and what I need to look like during this movement. Now, that being said, if we look at the last piece I want to kind of get to is we look at reps and sets and so forth. If we do plan core training, is the other mistake we make is, because we chase that burn, is that we do 100 crunches, right? Well, if you look at the physiology of those tissues, like rectus abdominis is one of your biggest force producers you have in your body, and yet we train it like it's a rotator cuff, right? If you're going to do things for your lower traps, you're going to do things for your rotator cuff, you're going to do things like that, those are small intrinsic muscles, and the physiology of those are more type 1, right? Slow twitch, motor units. Those need long extended period sets, right? Those 60-second holds and those sorts of things. Your big prime movers, those external obliques, those abdominals, they're going to produce a lot of force. So they're going to respond really well to 5 to 10 reps of high load. So like understanding the tissues that are involved and how do we actually program for that is another huge mistake. So if you are even going to isolate that out, please don't do 100 of them. Like, yes, you'll get the psychological gratification of feel the burn, but that doesn't necessarily equate to better function. But we also have to understand that what if I am trying to build better, stronger ab muscles from an aesthetic standpoint? Well, it's no different than anything else. If we look at hypertrophy in any other tissue, right? And Andy Galpin just did an amazing podcast with Andrew Huberman, just talking about exercise science stuff. It's a masterclass in exercise science. And
those
said hypertrophy.
They have a bromance going on right now, and I think it's amazing because those guys are just like friggin' geniuses. And I got a little secret crush on both of those guys. I'll be the first one to admit.
Oh, you and me, total man crush on those two. So with that, Andy said it's pretty simple. Like, it's anything between 6 and 30 will get you hypertrophy, and mix up those ranges because there's different mechanisms for hypertrophy. So if you're looking to build actual ab tissues, if you're lean enough that you can actually see them and it's going to make a difference, right? Then yes, that's a concern, and that's something that you need to consider, right? So my son actually just won his first bodybuilding show last week, And you know, when you're going to go stand on stage in your underwear, it's going to matter if you have developed abdominal muscles. So the training for him is going to be really different. Actually, I had one of my pro baseball players ask me, he's like, how is my training different than his training? And we're going to do, I think this, I wrote this down as a whole live that we could do, like the difference between training for aesthetics versus training for performance. And it's really polar opposites, right? Is you as a pitcher, I want you to be as efficient and economical as possible and produce the most amount of effort with the least amount of, or I'm sorry, the most amount of outcome with the least amount of effort, right? Where he wants to do the opposite. I want to create the most amount of stress possible, right, in those tissues to create physical change. So it's almost polar opposites of what you want to have. So all these things hopefully spun your head a little bit and made it a lot more simple than crunches and planks. But that's really, you know, that's why we created the course, to make you think, right? And we say it right in our online course, we say it in our live courses, is that if at any point makes you stop and think and say, well, I never considered that, never thought about that, you know, then we've done our job, right? So so that's kind of what we wanted to have happen when we created the course. But this is just one segment of core training. Next week, we're going to talk about things that affect movement, right? And most of you are going to think it's tight hip flexors and weak glute medius. But it's a lot more than that. Like, we're going to talk about stuff that has absolutely nothing to do with exercise. And that has everything to do with impacting your movement. And so that's going to be our discussion next week. And if you haven't been following us, thanks for dropping by. The way we do it is every week we have a different theme, different topic. This week's obviously core training. We have a bunch of posts throughout the week. So follow us at Principles of Program Design on Facebook or Instagram. And then what we do is we do this live every Friday at 1. The schedule will be changing as summertime is coming. We've got some ideas of different things we're going to do with that. So stay tuned on that end. And then we also have our courses, which are, you know, we're launching right now. We have our online course, which is up and ready to go. It's about 2 hours long. And to give you a little sneak preview into that, one of the things that Mike and I are going to talk about after this call is we created a free preview course where you're going to get to see about a 15 to 20 minute sample of the online course. And we're going to put that up for a limited time for free so people can check it out. So, you know, I thought about it the other day, Mike, like, you know, most people in our training industry are about, they have the top secret ways to get whatever. I'm the opposite of that. Like, I can't wait to share this shit. Like, so you have to stop me from giving it all away. So this little teaser course is going to be one of the ways we can kind of show you some of the stuff we've been working on. And then we have our live course, Cherry Hill, New Jersey, just outside of Philly. That's going to be in 2 weeks. It's going to be May 1st. So if you want to come down and join us, we're going to be spending 8 hours of all interactive stuff like this, of breaking down everything and anything having to do with how to write a program and get the most out of your clients and what they're looking for. So I will let you kind of wrap things up and add anything that you wanted to add.
Yeah, no, I think you did a pretty good job at covering those things, but we appreciate you guys tuning in. You know, if you have any topics you'd like us to cover, please shoot either one of us a DM and we'll try to get that covered. Also, if you have friends, colleagues, coworkers, etc., that you think that would find this talk interesting, we're going to post this live on both of our feeds, but also on the Principles of Program Design Instagram page as well. So this will be available soon. And you guys have a great Easter weekend, and we'll see you guys next week.